So we started with Daniel last week, and the challenge of what life looks like and how life must be lived even in the midst of collapse, even in the midst of things falling apart, even in the midst of an ungodly government. We were looking at that with Daniel. We talked about not allowing yourself to be re-educated, because that was one of the things that Daniel had to go through as a young man. They tried to teach him all the ways of Babylon and things like that. We talked about not being seduced by all the free stuff that they're going to offer to try to make you forget the fact that you're a slave. And then we talked about remembering our true identity and our true loyalty, no matter what anyone else is trying to tell you or what they're also trying to talk and call you, all the other things that they're trying to make you into. We have to remember who we are. And so this is another one out of Daniel chapter 1 where we're talking about conviction amid all sorts of opportunity or amidst compromise. We need to remember who we are and who we are supposed to be. When we looked at the names of the young men that are part of this, we looked at Daniel, that he is God and is my judge. Hananiah, that Yah has been gracious. Mishael, who is what God is. And Azariah, that Yah has helped. So these are their names. These are their identities. This reminds them of who they are in the midst of all of these. And these young men, they may be teenagers, had to remember their life and what their life was like, what their life was defined by, how it was ordered, how it was structured, how they lived it while they were back in Israel, because they're not in there. They're not in Israel anymore. They had to remember what their life was like in Jerusalem, living under, being educated in some of the reforms that happened and took place under Josiah. But they also had to remember what it was like when they saw their culture, their leadership, and all those things turn away from the ways of God, when they abandoned the ways of God, and the rapid decline that happened as a result. So Josiah is an example for them of the stand that a young person can take and the difference that they can make. Because Josiah was only 8 years old when he became king in the southern kingdom of Judah. How many of y'all would think at 8 years old, I'm ready to take on that task? I'm ready to lead a nation at 8 years old. Anybody? Yeah, I figured you would. You're the type for that. And it was several years after he became king that before the Torah scroll was even found. In total, he reigns for 31 years. It says Josiah was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidah, and daughter of Adiah of Bolzkath. Now, so if he was 8 years old when he became king, he reigned for 31 years. That means he's how old when he dies? Somebody do the math. 39. There you go. Josiah is one of the few kings who received praise for how they live and how they conducted themselves as king. He's one of the few that the scripture says this about. Now he did what was right in the eyes of Adonai and walked in all the ways of his father David and turned not aside to the right or to the left. And so he was commended for all of this. He did what was right in God's eyes, not what was right in his own eyes, not in what everybody wanted him to do or the pressures that were existing at the time. He walked, he lived, he even tried to rule like David did, considering the ways of God not as an afterthought, but first. What would God have me do in these moments, in these situations? And he started doing it while he was still pretty young, and he started doing it before he even found the book of the law, before he even found the Torah. In 2 Chronicles chapter 34, so he's 8 years old when he became king. So in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still young, he began to seek after the God of his father David. And in the 12th year, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem from the high places, the Asherah poles, and the carved and molten images. So if he's starting at 8 years old, and it's the 8th year of his reign, when he really starts trying to take his faith and his walk more and more seriously, he's how old? 16. And then it says, in the 12th year, so 4 years later, so now he's about how old? He's about 20. Right? He's at 16, he started to take his faith seriously. He started to seek God for himself. He's starting to study. He's starting to look at the scriptures. And in 4 years, he realizes the responsibility of the king to not allow false worship to be practiced in the land of promise. And so he begins taking out all of these things that don't belong. He began purging Judah and Jerusalem of their corruption. He was essentially draining the swamp of the nation. Y'all heard that phrase lately? He's draining the swamp of Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah. And some people loved him for it, but there was a lot of people who did not. It was all those ones that liked the high places, liked the Asherah poles and the carved images and molten things that they have there. Judah and Jerusalem essentially had what the equivalent of a deep state that favored all of these pagan practices over that covenant loyalty of God. And Josiah, he's 16 when he starts looking at his faith and taking it seriously. That's right around the same age that Daniel is when he's starting to face everything in the book of Daniel that we'll get to. But Josiah, he starts to take down high places and all these different places. He took on the deep state of his era and removed as much as he could. Stuff that was probably, very beautiful in some ways. It was probably very expensive in some ways, from which many of the leaders, many of the priests, many of the deep state of his era probably made a lot of money from. Right? Because those things brought in money. And all that Josiah was removing would have displeased many in that kind of establishment, but it didn't matter their opinion. Right? Even if it displeased the establishment, it pleased God. Remember, he's one of the few that is commended. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, because God is the one whose opinion really matters. God is the one who's going to judge the nation for all of that garbage. And God promised he was going to do it. But Josiah was a bit of a reprieve. How many of y'all have heard that term in the last few years? A reprieve from judgment. That's what Josiah is. When you look at 2 Kings chapter 22, this is after they'd found the book of the law. And he goes to inquire of the prophetess, Huldah the prophetess. It says, "But to the king of Judah," that's Josiah, "who sent you to inquire of Adonai, thus will you say to him, Thus says Adonai, God of Israel, as for the words that you have heard, because your heart was softened." And listen to these reasons why the reprieve takes place. "Because your heart was softened, and you humbled yourself before Adonai when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse. And because you have torn your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard you, declares Adonai. Therefore, behold, I will gather you to your fathers, and you will be gathered to your grave in shalom, in peace. So your eyes will not see all the disaster that I am bringing on this place." And then they brought back word to the king. All right? God had a judgment that was coming against the nation because of all of their idolatry and all of their wrong practices. But Josiah, because of how he responded when he was confronted with the word of the Lord, because he tore his robe, because he repented, then that judgment was delayed or stalled or put off. He was the reprieve. And a reprieve is a relatively brief time in the life of this kingdom where the ways of God were honored and tried to live out. A relatively brief time. Daniel and his 3 friends were going to be born during this time. They were going to be educated during this time. They were going to be witnesses of this kind of faithfulness and the reforms that Josiah was putting in place from their government. And what a government could look like that was trying to live for the Lord. That's how they saw what it takes or what it looks like for a young man to take a stand for God. For Josiah, he was making changes. He was trying to turn the hearts of the nation back to God. He even began repairing the temple, which for some reason or another had been neglected. And think about this, see if this sounds familiar, because all of the money that was being brought in for its repair kept going into people's pockets or some other agenda items rather than what it was collected for. Kind of like in our country where we see it here, even in Tennessee, where they propose a new gas tax that's supposed to go for fixing the roads. Right? Y'all heard that kind of argument before? It's supposed to go for fixing the roads, but instead it goes into the general fund and they spend it wherever they want. Or the promise that was always made in every state when they talk about legalizing the lottery and things like that. Oh, all of this money that we bring in from the lottery is going to go to education. How often does that happen? Or if it does, it's maybe a really small amount from what they overall collect. Money that was supposed to go to the repair and upkeep of the temple was going to other places or in people's private pockets. So it says, it came to pass in the 18th year of Josiah's reign, of King Josiah. So again, he started taking his faith seriously in the 8th year. Now it's the 18th year. So it's been about 10 years. And so if he was 16 when he started taking his faith seriously, he was 8 years old when he started reigning. So the 18th year means he's about how old? He's what? About 26 at this point, right? So in the 18th year of King Josiah, that the king sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, the scribe, to the house of Adonai, saying, Go up to Hilkiah the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and let him weigh the silver that is brought to the house of Adonai, has been brought to the house of Adonai, which the doorkeepers have gathered from the people. Okay, so again, it's his 18th year. It's been about 10 years. He's been trying to drain the swamp of Jerusalem and getting priorities back in place for the nation. And now he starts working on even more than the budget. He says, Then let them give it into the hand of the workmen appointed to oversee the work of the house of Adonai, and let them in turn give it to the workmen that are in the house of Adonai to repair the damages to the house, to those carpenters, builders, and masons, and for buying timber and cut stone to repair the house. So apparently this was getting pretty needed and pretty bad. Can you imagine the temple of the Lord going into disrepair? And he, Josiah is putting all this money straight into what we would call today shovel-ready jobs, right? Shovel-ready jobs to fix the temple of God. So why was the temple needing so much repair? It's because it had been neglected, because the hearts of the people, the hearts of the nation had wandered so far from him. Daniel would have lived while this kind of work was going on, while this kind of repair work was happening, seeing these kinds of improvements, hearing the work, the construction on the temple. Since he was one of the royal youths in Jerusalem, we learned about that last week, he would have watched the changes. He would have seen the repair, seen the neglect, and seen how it was fixed. He would have seen the dedication to God. And so Josiah's movement, draining the swamp of Jerusalem, it was bringing this reprieve, and he's leading people to the ways of God. And it was so successful in changing people's hearts and changing people's minds and lives That it was even affecting all of these builders and masons and merchants and construction workers, because they weren't even cheating anymore. It wasn't like they were charging $12,000 for a hammer, like we hear and read about sometimes in our defense budgets, or $50,000 for a toilet seat, or other wasteful, diverting spending that ends up somewhere else or in somebody else's pockets. Josiah's reforms was changing people in the way they act, the way they live, the way they conducted business. So much so that they didn't even have to count it and keep track of it. They didn't have to keep all their receipts like we do these days. However, there was no accounting made with them for the silver given into their hand, for they dealt faithfully. All of a sudden, all those people, under previous kings, they were probably lying and cheating and stealing and trying to get as much as they could, as fast as they could. But under Josiah and his leadership, they were dealing faithfully. And so these people began turning. They themselves started practicing their businesses accurately, correctly, fairly. They were practicing teshuvah, turning away from neglect and idolatry. And God was beginning to bless more and more. And sometimes He blesses by giving an opportunity for even more repentance and seeing of our ways that are still straying from Him. This comes along in verse 8. It says, Hilkiah the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found, in the midst of all of this cleanup, of getting rid of all this extra stuff that's in the temple, this junk, all of a sudden I have found a scroll of the Torah in the house of Adonai. And so Hilkiah gave the scroll to Shaphan, who read it. It says, Then Shaphan the scribe came to the king and brought back word to the king and said, Your servants have emptied out the silver that was found in the house of Adonai, and have given it into the hand of the workmen appointed to oversee the work on the house of Adonai. Shaphan the scribe also told the king, saying, Hilkiah the Kohen has given me a scroll. And then Shaphan read it before the king. And after the king heard the words of the Torah scroll, he tore his robes, he tore his clothes. This is his response to hearing it. Some argue that the scroll that was found was the whole Torah. Some will just say it was just Deuteronomy. Whichever. Josiah already had a heart to return to the Lord. A lot like David, King David, when he was confronted with his sin, he repented. Josiah, in hearing the words of the scroll of the Torah, of hearing the authority of the Word of God, responded much the same. He was hearing just how far they had strayed and what more needed to be done. And because he took his faith seriously, because he took his role as king seriously, he repented and turned and tore his robes. The tearing of the robes is proof that he was walking in the ways of his father David. And Daniel, he may have been born this same year, or maybe within just a few years old when this kind of thing starts to happen. But he was going to be growing up. He is going to be educated with this new understanding of things. Hello, that's in the wrong order. So when you look at some of the accomplishments of Josiah, he repented when he was confronted. Not everybody does that. Not everybody is willing to do that. Not every leader or king, president, whoever it is willing to repent when they are confronted. And he's starting to replace false worship with true worship. So when you skip over to chapter 23 of 2 Kings, it says, Then the king commanded Hilkiah, the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, the Kohanim of the second order, and the doorkeepers, to bring out of the temple of Adonai all the vessels made for Baal and Asherah and all the host of heaven. And he burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of Kidron, and took their ashes to Bethel. Now, where were these things all being kept? In the temple. What's this stuff doing in there in the first place? It didn't belong there. But they were finding, did I skip? What happened to one of my passages? That's chapter 4. I'm missing a couple of passages here. That's verse 7. I'm just reading to you now. Here's verse 5. It says, he stopped the idolatrous priests whom the king of Judah had ordained from burning incense in the high places, in the towns of Judah and around Jerusalem, as well as those burning incense to Baal, the sun, the moon, the constellations, and all the host of heaven. Verse 6 says, then he brought out the Asherah pole from the house of Adonai to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem. He burned it in the Kidron Valley, ground it into dust, and threw its dust over the graves of the common people. Then, this is verse 7, then he tore down the quarters of the male cult prostitutes that had been in the house of the Lord. Where the women had been weaving coverings for the Asherah. So there was a lot of things going on in the temple, even years later, after he became king, that did not belong there. And he's like, okay, I've heard enough. That's enough of that. We're draining all of this stuff out of here. How well do you think this went over? Do you think everybody was happy and liked it? Mm-mm. People don't like the cleanup. Some people like the mess. So he's repenting when he's confronted. He replaces false worship with true worship. He starts repairing the temple. He starts restoring the Torah, because they found this book of the Torah, and he starts renewing the covenant. He's like, guys, we haven't been doing any of this stuff. We haven't been taking any of this seriously. Back in chapter 23, verse 1, it says, then the king sent for, and they gathered all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem to him. Then the king went up to the house of Adonai, and all the men of Judah and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem with him, the Kohanim and the prophets, all the people, young and old. So who knows whether or not Daniel was even one of those among the crowd that was here for this. It says that in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which was found in the house of Adonai. Then the king stood by the pillar and cut a covenant before Adonai to follow Adonai, to keep his mitzvot, his laws, and his decrees with all their heart and soul, in order to fulfill the words of this covenant that were written in this scroll. So all the people stood for the covenant. And so when he had done all these things, repairing the temple, restoring the Torah, renewing the covenant, he even revived Passover. It says, then the king commanded all the people, saying, celebrate the Passover to Adonai your God, as it is written in this book of the covenant. So we may be inclined to think that they weren't keeping the Passover at all, but I don't think that's what this is saying. Celebrate the Passover to Adonai your God, not however you want to, not just in what you think is right or what is good, but you celebrate it as you have been given instructions in the book, in the Torah. They were likely celebrating it in all sorts of ways, but it needed to stop and celebrate it according to the words of the Torah. He says, for no Passover, this is verse 22, like this has been celebrated from the days of the judges who judged Israel, or in all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was observed for Adonai in Jerusalem. Okay? So then, the scriptures says this about Josiah, that this is the kind of leadership that Daniel would have seen for much of his young life. Before he was carried off, before he was captured and taken to Babylon, this is who would have defined good leadership for him. And it says about Josiah, before him there had never been a king like him who turned to Adonai with all his heart, with all his soul, with all his might, according to all the Torah of Moses, nor has any king like him risen since him. But again, Josiah's life, Josiah's reign as king lasted 31 years. It was only a reprieve, a temporary stay of God's judgment, because the judgment was still coming. Josiah, he started doing all these changes, taking his faith seriously at about 16 years old. The Torah scroll, when he was found when he was about 26. And it was only 13 years later, after the Torah scroll was found, that he died. At about 39 years old. He died in battle against Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt, who was on his way to fight against Assyria, who himself was eventually defeated by the growing Babylonian power. But I'm sorry, I forgot to read this one. The rest of the acts of Josiah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? It says, in his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up against the king of Assyria to the Euphrates River. But Josiah marched out against him, but Necho killed him at Megiddo when he saw him. And so his servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. When you see some of these things here. So this is Asher, this is Nineveh up here. Babylon and all these guys, the Chaldeans and things, are down this way. Pharaoh Necho is coming up this way, and he's wanting to meet and face the Assyrians. So this is kind of a close-up zoom of where Necho, Pharaoh, is coming. Josiah rides out from Jerusalem and meets him there at Megiddo. And he dies. He's killed in battle. This happened, his death happened in about 609 BC. And it's just a few years, it's believed, from when Daniel was carried off to Babylon in 605. We're trying to figure out all those numbers and things like that. But Josiah dies in about 609. This is another map of that same thing. And then in 605, 4 years later, young men like Daniel are carried off and taken to Babylon, following that Fertile Crescent. But see, what's interesting is in those years between Josiah's death, Josiah, who had been trying to do everything right by the Lord, and in the years between his death and when Daniel is carried off, not a single one of the kings, some of them were Josiah's sons, not a single one carried on in the ways of Josiah. Every single one of them did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord, even the ones that ruled for only 3 months. Can you imagine being so bad as a king that in 3 months you're declared to have done evil in the eyes of the Lord and you're done? Godly leadership was replaced by ungodly leadership with policies that displeased the Lord. False worship, the killing of the sacrifice of children. Daniel saw what happened to a nation that turns away from the Lord. Again, where are we? And we've talked about things in terms of being a reprieve, but what are we seeing in our day right now with the change in governments and things? But what he saw was the decline of the nation rapidly. What he saw was defeat and eventual destruction. And so, he also learned just how important it is to stand for the Lord whenever you have the opportunity, wherever you happen to be, even if that was standing as a slave to an even more ungodly government than the one that you left. Even if the reprieve was over, Daniel still had to choose how he was going to live and what he was going to do to govern his life. Daniel chapter 1. So it says, then, this is chapter 1, verse 3. says, then the king told Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel from royal descent and nobility. It says, youths without any defect, handsome, proficient in all wisdom, knowledgeable, intelligent, capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Again, we talked about that a bit more last week with the re-education kind of stuff. Verse 5 says, the king allotted them a daily portion from the king's delicacies and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end they were to stand before the king. All right, so they were given the best food, free health care, free everything was provided for them, so long as they forget the fact that they were slaves. It says, now among them were some of the sons of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief officer gave them new names, again, trying to re-identify them, make them forget who they were, where they came from. It says, to Daniel, Belshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. I mean, we looked at this. Daniel was changed to Belshazzar, which means Bel, or the god Bel, will protect. Shadrach is inspired of Aku, another one of the deities. Meshach was belonging to Aku, and Abednego was a servant of Nego. I mean, they're trying to change their identity and change even their beliefs in their God. And this is supposed to last for 3 years. For 3 years, he's supposed to be eating from the king's table, the best that Babylon had to offer. He was supposed to be enjoying the free stuff. You know, and it's kind of like where we are in some respects right now. I would think that after 3 years of eating from the king's table, how do you think he would be? Do you think he'd be a little heavier? A little chunkier? Yeah, probably. But see, there was a problem with the food from the king's table, especially the meats from the king's table. And it would have been unclean for somebody like him, who remembered who he was and where he came from and what he believed. The food was either going to be the kind that was forbidden by the Torah, pork and other such things, or it was going to be meat that was sacrificed to an idol. Meat that was sacrificed to an idol. Wine that was offered to the gods of Babylon, Bel, Marduk, and any of the number of others. But of those, both of those disqualify the meat and the wine for someone who grew up under the leadership of somebody like Josiah. And the return of the Torah of God. And, last week we talked a lot more about resolve. How Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the king's delicacies or with the wine that he was drinking. So he entreated the chief official for permission not to defile himself. So this is one of those kind of moments. They were bringing him all of these things, and this young man was having to say, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to live this way. I don't want to live with all of this free stuff and all of these benefits. These kind of conversations that Daniel is having to have right here, they're going to have to happen more and more in our day and in the days ahead. Y'all realize that? That's coming, if it hasn't already. The further away from God our nation drifts, the more it will pressure us to compromise our walk with God and His ways. We just have to know that that is the truth. That is going to happen. And I'm sure there are some things that Daniel was not given a choice about in terms of the things that he learned or had to participate in, given that he was a slave, given that he didn't have the rights and freedoms that we enjoy. He probably couldn't control, the clothes that he wore, or the language that he spoke, or even the names that he had to call his friends in public. But what do you think he called them privately? Which names do you think he used when it was just them? I bet it was the names that they were given in Hebrew. He couldn't he might not have had the option to stop the keeping of the Sabbath in a palace in a kingdom where the Sabbath was not recognized. He would have had a hard time living that. So he found the part of his life that he could potentially control and have a say in, and that was what he eats. Amazingly, who would have thought that what you eat can honor God? Or what you eat can also dishonor God. It's not like the very first recorded sin had to do with food and eating something you were told not to eat, right? What you take in, what you eat can honor God, it can dishonor Him. But in order for him to follow through with his resolution, Daniel had to speak up. Daniel had to speak to his superior, his boss, so to speak, the man in charge over him. Some of you have already had to have conversations like this, when work or when school or ask you to do something that violates a conviction or a command of God. And if you haven't had that conversation yet, realize that it's only likely a matter of when and not if. It's more than likely a matter of when that conversation has to happen, not if that conversation will happen. You have to be mindful of which battles you're going to fight, which things are opinions. Opinions may be one thing, biblical principles may be something, or another, commands even more so. It may be things like working on a Sabbath or a feast day. The one that I see happening sooner rather than later will be if you have a conviction about whether or not you're going to take the vaccine thing or not. It may cost you your job. It may prevent you from getting other things or going other certain things, doing certain things. You may or may not be eligible for a benefit, a promotion, if you don't have it. I saw an article just this morning. I heard about it yesterday. There's a news article that the people who are putting on the Super Bowl coming up in the next few weeks, I think it's hosted down in Florida. And they're only allowing 22,000 spectators to be in the stands, right? But they're going to give out 7,500 free tickets. They're going to give free tickets to local healthcare workers that have been helping fight COVID all this time. But there's a condition. Guess what you have to have if you want to get one of those free tickets? You have to have had the vaccine. Otherwise, all that work that you've been doing doesn't really count. So we may be seeing the emergence of a new class or a new ranking system in our time, in our day, of what is allowed or what is not, or what you can do or what you can't do, based on something like that. These are not going to be easy moments. We need to understand that. They can be filled with fear, with hesitation, with uncertainty, and I'm sure that was the case for Daniel. I'm sure he did a lot of praying and seeking after God in all of this. But he had to first, before he even had that conversation, he had to be resolved. But then he got to experience some of this. Now God caused the chief officials to show mercy and compassion to Daniel. Once he had resolved that this was the life he was going to live, God was already working on his behalf because of that resolve, because of that commitment. For someone, for a boss or a teacher who does not share our convictions, who does not share that interest, for them to go along with or respond favorably requires mercy. That's the word chesed. It also requires compassion, which is the word racham, which literally means womb. And it's the kind of movement that you feel in your gut that causes a response like a mother does every time they feel a kick. It's supposed to, when they feel their child, it's supposed to develop that kind of affection for that person and what they're trying to do. Daniel had to speak. This is the other thing. Daniel had to go and be willing to speak before he knew whether he would have favor or not. This is what God was doing. Daniel didn't necessarily know that that was God was doing. He had to speak before he knew. And so will we. We will have to speak and speak up without knowing all of the outcome. So before you do, pray for favor. Before you have to go and have those kind of conversations, pray and ask God to cause favor and compassion in those that you're going to speak to. But also realize that you don't have a guarantee that it will be met with favor. Right? We don't have an absolute guarantee that it's going to go your way. Many faithful people trying to live faithfully by the word of God have been met with rejection, have been met with persecution for standing for the truth of their convictions. And if this happens to you, don't let that be an indicator to you that, well, I must be wrong. Because that's not an automatic indicator that you are in the wrong. It may indicate the degree to which people and things are getting worse in their rejection of God. There's a point when you read through the book of Romans chapter 1, when God gives people over to their shameful behavior and things begin to spiral further and further down from there. We need to be resolved. We need to pray for favor. We need to understand that there are no guarantees that everything is going to meet well for you. But remember what Peter has to say in 1 Peter chapter 3. He says, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? And that's kind of a rhetorical question, but it's not. What are the type of people who are going to harm you for doing good? The ungodly kind. The kind that reject God and His ways. Those are the ones who are going to harm you for doing good. But even if you should suffer for what is right, so again, you may be standing and trying to do what is good, and you may still suffer for it. You are blessed. Blessed by who? By God Himself. His hand is upon you. He says, do not be afraid or worry about their threats. Instead, sanctify or set apart Messiah as Lord in your hearts. That's a resolution. That's part of that resolve. Always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you for the reason, for the hope that is in you. And some of these questions may be coming from the people who are trying to harm you. We need to understand that. He says, yet with humility and reverence, keeping a clear conscience, so that whatever you are accused of, and they are going to accuse, right? Aren't there a lot of accusations flying around out there right now? Those who abuse you for your good conduct in Messiah may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if it is God's will, than for doing evil. So even when we try to take a stand, even when we are resolved and try to do everything right by God, we may be called to suffer even when we are doing good. But we need to also understand that God sees and He recognizes that, and it does not go unnoticed. You may be shamed now by a power in this world, but they will be put to shame by the King of the universe. Which one would you rather be? Which situation would you rather be in? But also notice that when you take a stand, this is, when going back to Daniel, when you take a stand and you want to live by your convictions, it's not just you that's put at risk sometimes in that. You need to have compassion towards that boss or that supervisor that you're talking to that's above you, because the one you're talking to could get in trouble for the decision they make with you. Right? That's what Daniel has to talk about. Sometimes when we are standing and resolving, we need to understand it may put others at risk. The chief official said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king. The king said, this is what you're supposed to eat. He is the one who's allotted you your food and your drink. Why should he see your faces looking poorly, unlike the other youths your age? Then the king would have my head because of you. Right? So it may put other people at risk. And sometimes the one above you may be sympathetic to your situation, but they may be scared of what's going to happen to them if they do what you suggest. He fears the king. He fears the authority. He fears the law or the government above him. He feared that Daniel and his friends would look bad, making him look bad and get him in trouble. So we don't want to ignore the reality that as we have an opportunity to show conviction and compassion to them who are also being put at risk, you keeping your convictions may get somebody else in trouble, so be sure to do your best to minimize the possibility. And I have no doubt that the temperament, the temperament that Daniel displayed in this exchange testified greatly to this chief officer. Daniel proposed a test. It's like, okay, I hear you. I can see that you're afraid. Yeah, that would be if we start looking bad. That could get you in trouble. I understand that. So he proposed a test to reassure the chief officer that he and his friends would be just fine. He proposed an alternative instead of what was imposed on him. And Daniel was confident that God would bless. And he knew that this food that he's proposing is going to be better for them than all that, the heavy, fatty foods and the stuff that would come off the king's table. He wasn't proposing something like, I don't want to eat it all. He didn't propose that. He was just wanting to limit it. He wasn't proposing, a diet book for all time. He was, but one that would honor God in the circumstances as best as he could control. So he gets to this. We need to be resolved. We need to pray for favor. We need to know that there are no guarantees, that it may be a risk for others, but we also need to have some alternatives as part of our idea, as part of our proposal. So he says, Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Test your servants for 10 days, giving us just vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then compare our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's delicacies, and treat your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. So in his proposal, Daniel had something measurable that could be used as evidence to support his proposal. And he's letting God show how much better life by these convictions are and can be. But how hard do you think it would have been over the next 10 days? How much pressure do you think they were under over those next 10 days? How many people do you think were making fun of them over the next 10 days, trying to pressure them, trick them, do anything they could to get them to eat the things that they didn't want to eat? But because Daniel and his friends knew the kingdom under Josiah's convictions, they witnessed that from Josiah. They knew that that was much better than the one that was led by those who did evil in the eyes of the Lord. That is a truth. And we need to understand that. You and I need to know that. You and I need to see that and understand that. That the world really needs to know that. That things work and run and operate better when God is the one who is put first. When His principles are put in place. When the things of God are being shown and demonstrated and led from the top down. The world needs to know it, and we may have more opportunities to show that in the days ahead, just as Daniel did. It says at the end of 10 days, their appearance looked better, and their bodies healthier than all the youths who ate the king's food. Lo and behold, he knew what he was talking about. And so the guard took away their delicacies and the wine they were supposed to drink and gave them the vegetables instead. God honored Daniel's faithfulness in living by his ways. They were healthier, better looking, but they were also better thinking and better serving. It says, now as for these 4 youths, God gave them knowledge and proficiency in every kind of wisdom and literature, and Daniel could understand all sorts of visions and dreams. And at the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, and that was how long? 3 years. The chief official presented them before Nebuchadnezzar. And when the king spoke with them, he did not find among all of them anyone like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they entered into the king's service. It says, in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and the astrologers throughout his realm. All of those alternatives that the pagan religions tried to offer, they could not match what Daniel and his faith gave back. And believe it or not, through Daniel, through his friends, God began changing the course and the future of the nation of Babylon with their conviction. So they were making change. They were challenging the authorities, just like they had seen Josiah do when he was 16 years old. Through this conviction, through standing for their faith and the living for God, the people taken off into exile, they had a voice, they had an advocate, they had someone to lead them, even in matters before the king, before the government. And Babylon needed that. Nebuchadnezzar needed that in the days ahead, because he was going to have some visions. He was going to have some troubles that were going to mess up his life. Even Persia, off in the future, was going to need that. America is going to need that. People that are willing to stand and live for God today. We need to pray that God raises up people like this in our government who will be able to influence the halls of government in any way that they can. We need to pray against our leaders that are doing what is right in their own eyes rather than doing what is right in the eyes of the Lord. If they're doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, we cannot stand with that. Instead, we need to hope and pray for and seek out that they hear the voice of wisdom and the benefits for a life and for a nation that is lived by his Torah. But for all of us who are living today, we need to understand that it won't always be easy. It won't always work out nicely. It may result in persecution. We may not always be delivered from it, but we should still be resolved to stand against it. We must live by our convictions and trust that the Father will provide. And so in the days ahead, remember the reprieve. Remember what it was like, when there was at least a semblance of a godly government. Remember how you've been raised, what you've seen, the truth that defines you. Remember your identity in Messiah, in Yeshua. Like Daniel, in trusting in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, even in the midst of an ungodly nation. Can you have your conviction in the midst of all the compromise that is going on? And so we come back into that same point, or a point that is repeated in the scriptures in many ways, but it is trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. And in all your ways acknowledge him, and he is going to do what? He will make your paths straight. We need things to be straightened out. We need our nation to have its ways straightened out. So we pray for people like Daniel. We pray for people like Josiah to rise up and do those kinds of things that are needed. But wherever we can, we'll need to be taking our stands as well.